the slides will be sent out afterwards. If you're happy to take questions during the actual briefing itself, and there will be maybe a short 5-minute Q&A session at the end for anything as a wrap up. So without any further ado, Amie, over to yourself, please.
Thanks, Kevin. So morning everybody. As Kevin said, before joining Scottish Engineering, I worked for North Ayrshire Council in their procurement department. So that was obviously being involved in commissioning a lot of contracts, a lot of works contracts, engineering contracts, a lot of supply contracts from manufacturers. So it's just a very interesting topic to me, especially now I'm going out and visiting a lot of member companies. It's something that a lot of people have a lot of questions for. And also it's something that when I'm out and about, people aren't so sure of, and that we get some emails in requesting some policies and things for public sector contracts. So today it's such a huge topic. You could probably go to like a week's crash course on this and still walk away with questions. So it's just a very general overview, and I've just picked out specific things that tie into employment law, and also specific things that I know members have asked me about. So in today's just kind of morning session, I'm just going to go through an overview of the process your bid goes through, as well speaking about working practices and how they are scored, and what they base that off of. As well, I'm going to have a look at the real living wage and how this ties into public sector contracts, as well as policies which public sector bodies will regularly ask for as part of their tender documentation, and as well just some useful resources that I think is worth you having a look at, which will help you filling in this tender documentation. So how your bid is evaluated. This can be quite technical, so I'm going to just try and simplify this down as much as possible. So obviously with your bid, a procurement process for a public sector body, it can take various different forms. It can be as a tender, it can be as a quick quote if it's fairly low value, but no matter what type of procurement process they use, it will usually follow this 3-step process. So when you're filling out your tender documentation, we can broadly split it into these 3 categories, which is the qualification, technical and commercial. So your first stage is qualification. That's really your selection criteria. So that's just highlighting anything that off the bat, if you don't meet that, you're going to be excluded. So this will usually have your single procurement document, which asks you a lot of questions. It's really trying to funnel out any businesses that maybe have criminal history, and as well, this is where they'll ask you for your minimum turnover, and as well as any relevant experience to the contract. And the purpose of that qualification stage is really to funnel out any businesses that don't have the capability to carry out the contract. So if they're looking for maybe works done that are worth a few million, but you're just an SME and maybe you've not got the turnover, or you've never done contracts of that kind of same nature, that's just designed to kind of at that stage funnel you out. And then moving on to the technical and quality stage, and that's what we're going to be speaking about a lot today. This is usually specific scored questions relevant to the contract. So this will be things like asking for like your methodology, samples of previous works. But as well, this is what a lot of the session this morning is going to focus on, is in this technical quality aspect, they can ask a lot of additional ethical questions, which usually kind of throw people off. And as well, after obviously your bids went through this stage, if you've made it through that original selection stage and the quality stage, that is when your commercial element of your bid will be priced. So that's usually where you'll have to fill out a bill of quantities or a pricing schedule. So that is just a brief overview of the process and the 3 different sections which questions can come under. So hopefully as I'm going through, if I'm referring to any of these terminology, you'll know where I am. It's basically got a language of its own. So I just want to look at how they evaluate your working practices, because this is something that flags up to us as an employment law team. So the extra ethical questions which tie into this part of the evaluation, they all kind of stem from the Scottish Government's sustainable procurement duty. I've hyperlinked that there if anyone wants to go on and look. But whatever public body it is commissioning a contract, whether it's a leg of the Scottish Government or a local authority, they'll have taken what's in this sustainable procurement duty and they'll implement it in their own processes. So this really looks at things like environmental issues, sustainability, equality and diversity, and fair and ethical trading. So this just kind of promotes that idea that with a public body, obviously they're spending public money, so they have to have a bit of thought behind that before they spend it willy-nilly. So before they can make that purchase, they've got to think about the implications of that, whether that be social, environmental, economic, and how this funnels into the area in which that public body operates. So they evaluate bidders based on this sustainable procurement duty on a number of ways, which I'm going to go through now. So fair work, when they're evaluating your fair work, I found this kind of good definition, which is taken from the Fair Work Convention, which the Scottish Government endorses. So this just says fair work is work that offers all individuals an effective voice, opportunity, security, fulfilment and respect. It balances the rights and responsibilities of employers and workers. It generates benefits for individuals, organisations and society. So in practice, the Scottish Government have embodied this idea of fair work into their Fair Work First paper. And this really sets out how they govern fair work in relation to the contracts that are being awarded by them. So I've put in these little boxes, there's 7 Fair Work First criteria, and when you're bidding for a public sector contract, you are expected to fulfil these. Usually when they're looking at the type of contract being commissioned, if they think that the Fair Work First criteria, this will be included in a scored question. So they'll actually be scoring bidders on how they implement these different Fair Work First criteria into their workforce. So just to take a look at each, the appropriate channels for effective voice, we would get a lot of questions on when I worked for public sector, because not everyone obviously is recognised by a trade union. So if you're asked a question on this, there's other methods of showing that you have channels for effective voice. This can even be things like just having a really clear grievance procedure, which deals with any complaints timely, and that you have a policy in place that your employees know that any issues are going to be heard. As well, it can be consulting with your employees when you're invoking a change. So if you can say that you maybe do employee surveys. As well, do you offer any team meetings where people have an opportunity to give their views? Do you offer any individual one-to-ones where people can get support and give their views? So even though in the paper it states such as trade union recognition, if you don't recognise a union, there is ways that you can embody this Fair Work First criteria. As well, investment in workforce development. So that's just quite self-explanatory, that one, just showing any training, that you have plans for your employees for their progression. No inappropriate use of 0-hour contracts. So when they're asking a question on the Fair Work First criteria, you want to be mentioning either that you give guaranteed hours contracts, or if you do use 0-hour contracts, give an example of the context, and basically explain how that use is appropriate. Action to tackle the gender pay gap and create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So this can include more obvious things like having an equality and diversity task force or policy in place, but also it can be less obvious things such as in recruitment. So you could be mentioning the way that you interview, if you do structured interviews, if you show the pay range of a role to kind of invoke discussion around pay negotiations. providing fair work for workers, for example, payment of the real living wage, which we're going to go on to talk about as well in the next couple of slides. Next one again is quite interesting, offering flexible and family-friendly working practices for all workers from day one of employment. This one obviously is actually asking for a bit more than what the legal requirement is, because right now to make a flexible working request, obviously it's after 26 weeks of employment. So this is just another example of the public sector really asking for what they want to see and what they think is best practice. So again, you would just be saying if you have a flexible working policy in place, and again, opposing the use of fire and rehire practices, which is the final Fair Work First criteria. So this is what they ask for. They ask that if you are going to be awarded a contract from the public sector, that you can demonstrate all 7 of these. And they can also monitor this throughout the duration of the contract and ask for any evidence. And just to show you how that looks in practice, when they ask for this Fair Work First, it's usually a scored question. I think it's usually around 5% of your whole bid, and this contributes to your quality scoring. And again, my advice is just when answering this, structure this around the 7 Fair Work First criteria. So down below, this is taken from the Scottish Government's website, and this is how they advise that you ask the question. So it just says, please describe how you commit to adopting Fair Work First for workers involved in the delivery of this contract. This should include current and planned actions that show how you will embed these during the lifetime of this contract. Answers should include tangible and measurable examples and should also describe how you will report on and demonstrate progress to the public body. So this last part again shows how that they can actually monitor this throughout the contract, and they're actually asking in this example question now how you plan to report on this. So just moving on, another big one in a lot of the tenders going out in the public sector is the payment of the real living wage. Just to note that this is different from the national living wage. So if we can see on this little diagram here, the payment of the national living wage is £9.50, whereas the real living wage is £9.90. So they sound very similar, but they're different things entirely. In many procurements, it will actually be mandatory to pay the real living wage. So if you're paying any employees or workers under this £9.90, it will automatically exclude you from the tender process. Also just want to point out that you don't actually have to be accredited by the Real Living Wage Foundation and have that accreditation. You just usually have to pay their rates. Again, I think this one's pretty topical just now. Obviously, with the cost of living crisis, this might be something that you're seeing more in public sector documentation, as they want to make sure that any suppliers that they're giving work to are paying their workers fairly in the context of the cost of living crisis. So this is just another example of a question. And we can see this is a real example question that would be in the invitation to tender. And we can see here that they're saying tenderers who fail to answer yes will not have their tender considered further. So if this was inserted into the tender pack at this point, they would be excluded from progressing and having their price considered. Sometimes, if it's not, sometimes they will ask this, but just for information purposes only. So it's just important to kind of read the question properly, because it's not on every contract that they'll require this. Sometimes it's just for information purposes where they'll report this back to the Scottish Government, but sometimes it will really exclude you from the bidding process. And again, another kind of employment law consideration that crops up in the procurement documents is the inclusion of modern slavery. So obviously, I've just got a little kind of definition of modern slavery in this first point. Forced labour is found across UK in sectors characterised by low-skilled, low-paid labour. So in contracts which have been commissioned in many of these industries which have a known history of modern slavery, they will tend to add an element of a modern slavery statement or question on the tender documentation. So in a lot of the construction ones I was involved in, they would have had this included. So any suppliers who can be brought out at that first, the selection stage, they can be totally knocked out if they've had any kind of legal repercussions coming from any human trafficking and exploitation legislation. So they can be knocked out if they've been found guilty of any of that. But more commonly, what will happen is in that second stage, the technical stage, they'll include their modern slavery statement or a question which will set out some requirements, and to proceed you'll have to basically agree that you'll comply with their conditions. So this includes things like paying minimum wage, having a grievance procedure, hiring migrant workers directly where possible, supplying employment contracts in the language that the worker can understand, and no fees for recruitment directly or indirectly associated with travel or processing any documents. So this will usually be in that second stage, and there'll be a statement where you can go in, read all their conditions, and usually you'll have to agree to this to proceed on and have your price considered. And again, just tying in with things that member companies ask us for as an employment law team. In the technical quality evaluation, they can ask for policies that demonstrate that you have these in place. So these can be things like an environmental policy, any sort of code of ethics or human rights policy, an equality and diversity policy, health and safety policy. If it's a contract which has got quite a large IT element, there can be an information security policy and a quality policy as well. So usually these are requested on a pass-fail basis. So you would supply your policy and you'd be passed on that section. But again, if you weren't to put in, or you were to put in the wrong policy, you could fail on this. So this kind of brings us into the next part. If any of these, if you're someone who regularly bids for public sector contracts, or it's something that you're looking to venture into, it's useful to have these policies in place. And that kind of leads me on to my last slide of some useful resources just to kind of start your venture into bidding for public sector contracts. So the first one here is the supplier journey. I think this is a really good site which outlines the kind of different procurement routes. What I was kind of speaking about in that first slide, it does have a language of its own. So this is good because it's got a glossary of commonly used terms, what they mean. It's got really good checklists, instructional videos. And again, when I was speaking about the policies in the last slide, we can obviously always help with anything like that, but the supplier development programme, I think that's really worth signing up to, making an account for your business, because it's a really user-friendly site, and that's where you'll get policy templates on here for all of the policies listed here. They have on there, which you can take and just alter to suit your business. And as well, they do a lot of events, a lot of meet the buyer events, which are good to go to, and a lot of free training and guides on there. So that's just, these are hyperlinked on the slides, which will go out at the end, but they're just two really invaluable resources. And then that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for listening. If anyone has any questions at all, I'm happy to take them. I've also got two contacts, one in a local authority and another contact in the Scottish Government. So any more complex questions, feel free to pass them on to me, and they said they're happy to have any questions relayed on to them.
So happy to open the floor to any other participants to ask questions of Amie, while you've got her here just now. It looks like you've stunned them all into silence at this early time in the morning. Maybe not everyone's had their coffee.
Very technical for 8 AM.
Right, so as Amie said, we'll send out the slides and a copy of the recording later on as well. What often happens with breakfast briefings is people go away and start their day job and then have questions later on. You've got Amie's contact details there, so feel free to reach out to her with any questions you have on this topic. And as she said, if there's anything more complicated, she can contact her contacts elsewhere in the procurement land. So going. Any final questions? If not, I shall let you get on with the rest of your day, folks. Okay. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.